It was just past 6 in the evening when the restaurant started filling up. The soft hum of conversations blended with the clinking of plates and the low, steady rhythm of music playing in the background. The lights were warm, the kind that made the wooden tables glow, and the smell of fresh bread mixed with roasting coffee lingered in the air. She walked through the tables with practiced ease, balancing a tray with a steady hand, smiling at the people who nodded back or waved a quick thanks. She had done this many times before, but tonight, something felt a little different, though she couldn't have said why. She had been a waitress for a long time, long enough to know how to keep calm no matter what happened. She had seen people who were happy, sad, angry, or bored. She had dealt with customers who were rude, demanding, or completely unreasonable. She had learned to smile through it all, to keep her own feelings tucked away so the job felt easier and the day less heavy. Her hands moved automatically, pouring water into glasses, taking orders, adjusting chairs, folding napkins, all while keeping her mind alert, noticing every little detail. It was during one of these quiet moments that she noticed him. He walked in with a presence that made the air feel different. People turned their heads, some whispering softly to their companions. He was well-dressed, clearly wealthy, the kind. A person whose name would be recognized in magazines or newspapers, though she didn't know it yet. There was a confidence in the way he moved, a quiet authority that came without words, but it was sharp, almost cutting. He scanned the room with an exacting eye, as though judging everything he saw at the tables, the lights, even the staff. She felt a small flutter of nerves, but she didn't let it show. She had learned a long time ago that no matter who walked in the door, she treated every person with the same level of respect. She approached his table with a polite smile, holding her notepad loosely in one hand. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice steady. "Welcome. Can I get you started with a drink?" He looked up at her with a faint smirk, the kind that seemed more curious than friendly. "Just water," he said. There was a hint of impatience in his tone, and she sensed he expected more than that, more attention, more bending to his will. But she did not falter. She nodded and moved to fetch his water, keeping her movements smooth and professional. As she returned with a glass of water, he watched her closely. He asked questions that were not really questions, more like tests, as though he were seeing if she would stumble or hesitate. But she answered with calm, simple honesty, nothing flashy, nothing to impress him unnecessarily. She treated him like any other customer, taking his order, recommending dishes when he asked, keeping her tone even and polite. There was no hint of fear or flattery. She was confident in herself, and that confidence was like a shield, protecting her from the sharpness of his gaze. At first he seemed annoyed, was used to people fawning over him, saying yes to everything, catering to his demands without a thought. But she did not. She did not rush to please him, did not lower her tone or change her manner. She answered questions directly, repeated details when necessary, and kept the conversation brief and respectful. Movement slightly, a movement so small it might have been unnoticed by anyone else, but she noticed. He was not used to being treated like a normal person, someone whose authority could not bend others immediately. The other tables had started to quiet down a little. There was a subtle tension in the air, like everyone could feel that something unusual was happening. Most people would have ignored it, but those who watched could see it the way she stood, the way she spoke, the calm steadiness in her movements. She did not act bravely or show off. She simply existed in her own space, refusing to let anyone push her off balance. It was remarkable in its simplicity. As he ate, he became more challenging. He asked for things in ways that were deliberately difficult, small tests, to see how far he could push her patience. He requested changes in dishes, double checks on ingredients, and seemed to enjoy seeing if she would react. But she remained composed. She did not flinch, did not apologize unnecessarily, and did not allow him to take control of the situation through intimidation. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing across his lips. "You are different from the others," he said. It was not a compliment. It was more like a statement of fact. She looked at him calmly and simply nodded. She did not need to explain herself, and she did not feel the need to charm him. Her quiet strength was evident in every gesture, every word spoken with care. It was interesting to watch, almost like watching two currents collide. On one side, there was him, used to control, used to power, used to people bending to his will. On the other side, there was her, accustomed to challenges of a different kind, the daily grind, the constant struggle to be seen as more than a worker, the need to hold on to self-respect even in small, crowded rooms. Neither was willing to give in, and that unspoken tension made the room feel alive in a new way. She thought about her life as she moved around the restaurant. Life had not been easy, not for her or for many people she knew. She had spent years working hard for every small victory. Every tip, every smile, every acknowledgement of her work felt like a small triumph. She had learned that confidence was not something handed to you. It was something you carried inside, a shield no one could take from you unless you allowed it. Tonight, she carried it proudly, quietly, without needing anyone else to notice. The billionaire at the table continued to test her, making small remarks, raising his voice slightly when something was not done exactly as he expected. Many people would have felt fear or irritation, but she felt something else, a quiet determination. She would not allow herself to be disrespected simply because he had more money or power. Money could buy a lot of things, but it could not buy dignity or courage. She moved through her duties with grace, handling each request with patience and skill, never letting him see any anger or frustration in her eyes. Other staff members were watching too. Some admired her quietly, some were nervous, unsure if she was taking a risk. But she did not see it as a risk. She saw it as an opportunity to show, not through words, but through actions, that respect is something earned by behavior, not demanded by wealth. She smiled at other customers as she passed, kept the plates moving, checked on tables efficiently, all while keeping her focus on the one table that had drawn all attention. It was during a small moment, when she refilled his water for the second time, that he leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Why do you not act like the others?" he asked quietly, almost curious now rather than commanding. She placed the glass on the table with careful precision and looked at him steadily. "I treat people how I wish to be treated," she said simply. There was no challenge in her tone, no arrogance, just quiet honesty. He was momentarily taken aback. He was used to flattery, to people trying to impress, to bending to authority. But she was none of those things. She was simple, direct, and strong in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. He had expected compliance, and instead he received dignity. For the first time in a long while, he did not have control. The rest of the evening passed in a tense but calm rhythm. He made more requests, more subtle tests, but she continued to navigate them with ease. Nothing was done to provoke or anger him, yet nothing was done to allow him to dominate. It was a quiet stand, a small rebellion in the form of simple human respect. When the meal ended, he sat back in his chair, silent for a long moment. She approached with the check, as was routine, her movements calm and professional. He looked at her and finally smiled. Not the smirk from before. It's not the expression of power, but a real smile, faint and slow. It was an acknowledgement, subtle but significant, that he had encountered someone he did not expect, someone who had not bowed to power or wealth. She thanked him politely as he left, nodded to the other staff quietly, and returned to the kitchen. She did not celebrate, did not make a show of her small victory. She simply continued with her work, pouring water, taking orders, serving food, all with the same calm, steady grace. But inside there was a small spark, a quiet satisfaction. She had held her ground. She had shown that respect and courage are not given by wealth, and even the most powerful person could not take them away. By the time the restaurant finally slowed down, the room returned to its usual hum. The lights were softer, the music low, the smell of food lingering in the air. She leaned against the counter for a moment, taking a deep breath. It had been an unusual night, a night where the ordinary met the extraordinary. What would happen next? But she knew one thing: she had stayed true to herself. And sometimes that is the strongest thing a person can do. The next day began like any other in the restaurant. She arrived early, tying her apron and checking the tables, making sure everything was in order. The morning sun filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow over the floor. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air. It was quiet at first, the calm before the usual rush of lunch orders. She moved with practiced efficiency, greeting her coworkers, taking stock of supplies, quietly preparing herself for another day of long hours. Even though it was just another morning, the events of the previous evening, G lingered in her mind. She had been polite, professional, and calm. But something about the way he had looked at her, the way he had paused and smiled at her quietly, had unsettled her in a strange way. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like a ripple that ran under her skin, small awareness that this man was different from anyone she had ever dealt with. And yet she reminded herself she had done nothing extraordinary. She had simply been herself, honest and firm. That was all. The lunch crowd started to arrive and the restaurant filled quickly. The hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes returned. She moved among the tables, taking orders, serving drinks, and offering polite smiles. Her mind, however, kept returning to him. She wondered if he would return, if she would see him again, and what would happen if he did. She shook her head slightly, dismissing the thought. There was no point in worrying over things she could not control. Then, just as the lunch rush began to peak, the door opened again. He walked in. The familiar air of authority and quiet power seemed to follow him, making the restaurant feel smaller, more tense. Customers noticed him as he moved toward a table near the window. Some whispered to their companions, glancing at her as though waiting to see how she would react. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and approached him with the same calm professionalism she had shown the night before. "Good afternoon, sir," she said with a gentle, confident smile. "Welcome back." He looked at her for a long moment, a faint smirk forming. It was not a smile of amusement, not yet. It was the expression of someone testing the waters, wondering how the tides had shifted since their last encounter. "Good afternoon," he replied, his voice smooth but carrying a trace of challenge. He did not ask for a menu immediately. Instead, he observed her, his gaze measuring, calculating. She poured him water first, the routine she had perfected over the years feeling natural and steady in her hands. "Would you like to order now, or are you still deciding?" she asked politely. He hesitated, then said, "I will decide in a moment." There was a subtle pause, and she noticed that he seemed slightly more cautious than before, as if he remembered something from their previous encounter. She nodded silently and moved away to tend to other tables. Her back straight, her mind focused. As the lunch hour progressed, he began making small requests, deliberately testing her patience and her willingness to follow his expectations. He asked for subtle changes in the menu, extra attention to detail, and repeated confirmations of every order. Most waitstaff would have become flustered, rushed, or submissive, but she remained composed, moving efficiently between tables, keeping her tone polite, firm, and calm. At one point, he asked for a dish to be remade, claiming it was not perfect. He expected frustration or an apology that went beyond reason. Instead, she explained gently why the dish had been prepared the way it was, and offered a solution that maintained the integrity of the kitchen's work. "We can adjust it according to your preference," she said softly, "but this is how the chef recommends it." She did not waver, did not falter in her words, and did not show irritation. He paused, a small frown forming. This was not what he was used to. In his world, people rarely spoke so directly while still maintaining courtesy. He expected people to either comply immediately or fear the consequences of displeasing him. She did neither. She treated him with respect, but she also treated him like any other customer, a person who deserved good service but not special privilege. He leaned back in his chair, observing her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet frustration. There was a strange energy in the room now. Other customers sensed it too, though they did not fully understand what was happening. They were watching a subtle power struggle unfold, one not defined by money or influence, but by integrity and calm authority. Throughout the lunch hour, she continued her work seamlessly. She refilled glasses, checked on tables, carried plates, and answered questions. Her movements were fluid, almost automatic, but her mind remained sharp. aware of his presence without letting it dominate her thoughts. She noticed the small details, the way he tapped his fingers, the faint crease of his brow, the slight change in tone when he spoke to her. Each detail informed how she responded, always polite, always firm, always steady. At one point, a minor mistake occurred in the kitchen. A dish intended for his table was delayed. Most waitstaff would have panicked, apologizing profusely, offering discounts or excuses. She calmly returned to him and said, "There has been a small delay with your order. The chef is preparing it freshly for you, and it will be out shortly. Thank you for your patience." She did not apologize excessively or bow to his authority. She stated the facts simply and offered reassurance. He studied her silently for a moment. And then something unexpected happened. He smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was genuine. He realized that he had underestimated her strength, her calm composure, and her ability to maintain dignity under pressure. He had expected submission, but he found none. He was intrigued, even impressed, though he would not admit it outright. The lunch continued in this delicate balance. He asked questions, tested boundaries, and she responded with patience and clarity. He tried subtle provocations, small comments designed to make her flinch or apologize unnecessarily. But she did not react emotionally. Each time he attempted to assert dominance, she responded calmly, firmly, respectfully. By the time the lunch hour ended, the restaurant had quieted down again. She had served every table efficiently, handled every request with grace, and maintained the same calm composure she had shown from the beginning. He remained at his table for a while, looking out the window, seemingly deep in thought. She wondered what was going through his mind, but kept her distance, respecting his space, while remaining attentive to his needs. Finally, he called her over. She approached cautiously, but confidently, standing straight and maintaining a neutral, polite expression. He looked at her directly, and for a long moment there was silence. Then he said, "You are unlike anyone I have met before. Most people would have lost their patience or tried to flatter me. You do neither." She smiled faintly. "I believe in treating people with respect," she said simply. "I also believe in honesty and fairness. That is all." He studied her again, this time with something closer to admiration, though it was mixed with frustration. He was not used to meeting someone who would stand firm without confrontation, someone who would hold their ground without arrogance. The realization seemed to unsettle him slightly, but it also sparked a quiet curiosity as he left the restaurant. He left a generous tip, but it was not the tip itself that mattered. It was the acknowledgement that he had encountered someone strong, someone principled, someone who would not bend to power simply because it existed. He had expected compliance, and instead, he found dignity. She returned to the counter after he left, her heart still calm but filled with a quiet satisfaction. She did not celebrate aloud or make a scene. She continued with her work, helping other customers, serving food, and maintaining the steady rhythm of the restaurant. But inside, she felt a spark of quiet understanding that she had proven something important. She had shown that strength, patience, and integrity could stand against wealth and power without needing to fight, shout, or display arrogance. The rest of the afternoon passed smoothly. The restaurant settled into a gentle flow, and she moved among the tables, her presence calm and confident. She reflected on the events of the day, knowing that moments like this were rare. They were moments where ordinary life intersected with extraordinary challenge. And the way she handled it defined not only how others saw her, but how she saw herself. By the time the evening arrived, she felt a quiet exhaustion, but it was the kind that came from satisfaction, not stress. She had met a challenge, faced it with dignity, and remained true to herself. That knowledge gave her a sense of strength she carried quietly as she prepared to close the restaurant, clean the tables, and organize the kitchen for the next day. The memory of the man, the billionaire, lingered in her mind. She did not know if he would return, if he would try to test her again, or if he had been impressed enough to leave things as they were. But she knew one thing. She had handled the encounter with grace, calm, and unwavering self-respect. And that was something that no amount of money, power, or influence could take from her. As she turned off the lights and closed the doors for the night, she took a deep breath, feeling the satisfaction of a day well handled. Life would continue, challenges would come, and difficult people would always exist. But she had proven to herself and to someone who believed he held all the power that dignity and courage could not be bought, borrowed, or broken. They were hers, quietly and completely. The next morning began quietly, but she felt a subtle tension lingering from the previous days. The memory of the man's calm yet scrutinizing gaze from yesterday stayed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something different was coming. She tied her apron and checked the restaurant one last time, making sure everything was in order. She arranged the silverware, wiped down the tables, and straightened chairs, moving with the smooth efficiency she had developed over years of practice. Even as she worked, she thought about the way he had left yesterday. That small nod of acknowledgement, the quiet tip, and the unspoken respect. It was unusual for her to dwell on interactions with customers, but he was different. He had the presence of someone used to commanding attention, someone who was rarely challenged. And she had challenged him, though silently, simply by remaining calm and firm. That thought made her both cautious and quietly confident. The morning passed uneventfully, the usual patrons coming in for coffee and breakfast. She moved among the tables with her familiar smile, taking orders and engaging in polite, light conversation. There was a rhythm to the work, comforting flow that reminded her of why she had chosen this job, despite the long hours and modest pay. Each smile she received, each thanks from a customer, reminded her that dignity and kindness mattered, even in small ways. Then, as the lunch hour began, the door opened, and there he was again. His presence seemed to fill the room immediately, like the shift of gravity pulling attention toward him. Some of the staff whispered under their breath, uncertain whether to treat him like any other customer or defer to the unspoken authority he carried. She felt a familiar flutter of nerves, but did not let it show. She took a deep breath and approached him with her usual calm, steady steps. "Good afternoon, sir," she said politely. "Welcome back." He looked up at her, and for the first time there was a faint trace of challenge in his smile. He did not just want to test her patience today. There was curiosity in his gaze, a desire to see how far her composure could stretch. "Good afternoon," he said smoothly, almost conversationally. "I hope you remember me," she nodded, keeping her tone light but confident. "Of course," she replied. "How can I assist you today?" He studied her quietly for a long moment, as though measuring her response. He asked for the menu, scanned it quickly, and then began to ask questions designed to test her knowledge and patience. He requested substitutions, asked for detailed explanations about ingredients, and probed about the way dishes were prepared. Each question was a small challenge, a chance to see whether she would falter or rise to meet it. She answered each question carefully and clearly, refusing to be rushed or intimidated. She explained the menu items honestly, described how dishes were made, offered suggestions politely without appearing eager to please him specifically. There was no flattery, no unnecessary submission, just calm, professional clarity. He frowned slightly as she answered, clearly surprised by her composure. Most people in his world would have bowed to pressure, offering apologies and bending to his will. But she did not. She treated him with respect, yes, but she also treated him like any other customer. Someone whose requests could be met without compromising her dignity. Throughout the lunch, he continued to test her. At one point, he asked for a dish that was not on the menu, something elaborate and unusual. Most waitstaff would have panicked or said it was impossible. She paused briefly, assessing the request, and then replied calmly, "I can speak with the chef to see if it is possible. It may take a little extra time, but we can prepare it according to your preference." He raised his eyebrows, a small expression of surprise and admiration flickering across his face. It was not often that he encountered someone willing to meet a challenge without frustration or fear. She moved smoothly, communicating with the kitchen staff efficiently and ensuring that his request was fulfilled to the best of their ability. As the meal progressed, he began to speak more freely, sharing stories about his work, his travels, and his experiences. She listened politely, responding when necessary, but never overstepping or inserting herself into his world. She remained grounded in her own reality, focused on her work and yet aware of the subtle shift in his demeanor. The man who had entered, expecting to dominate and control, now seemed slightly unsettled, as though realizing that he had underestimated her. At one point, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You are very different from anyone I have met in a long time," he said quietly. "Most people would have tried to impress me or avoid eye contact. You do neither." She smiled faintly, maintaining her calm composure. "I treat people as they should be treated," she said simply. "I do my best in every situation, and I expect honesty and respect in return. That is all." He studied her silently, and for the first time, there was a hint of respect in his eyes. He realized that he was dealing with someone whose strength was not measured by wealth or power, but by calmness, dignity, and self-respect. He had expected someone who could be intimidated, persuaded, or flustered, and instead, he found a woman who stood firmly in her own space without aggression or arrogance. The atmosphere in the restaurant was charged with subtle tension. Other customers noticed the dynamic, though most could not articulate it. They could see the exchange, sense the quiet battle of wills, and yet it was conducted without shouting or drama. It was almost like watching two people speak in a language of actions rather than words, where every gesture, every pause, and every tone carried weight. She moved between tables with ease, ensuring that every customer received the same attentive care. She refilled drinks, carried plates, answered questions, and kept the flow of the restaurant smooth and steady. All the while, she remained aware of him, the billionaire, and the subtle challenge he posed. Each time he asked for something difficult, she met it with calm determination, refusing to let his expectations dictate her behavior. At one point, a minor mishap occurred in the kitchen. A dish intended for another table was delayed slightly. She calmly explained the situation to the customer affected and ensured they were accommodated without fuss or drama. He observed quietly from his table, his expression unreadable. He was used to control, used to influence, and used to being able to dictate outcomes immediately. Here, he saw a different kind of power, one that did not rely on fear or authority, but on patience, competence, and self-assurance. As the lunch hour drew to a close, he remained at his table longer than necessary, sipping his drink and watching the restaurant with a thoughtful expression. She approached to clear the table, maintaining her calm and professional demeanor. He looked at her directly, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then he said, "You have a quiet strength. Most people with your position would have been nervous, timid, or eager to please. You are neither." She nodded politely. "I believe in doing my job to the best of my ability," she said softly, "and in treating everyone with respect." There was a pause, and then he smiled. A small, genuine smile, unforced and faint. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. "I did not expect this." She returned to her work without saying more. She did not seek praise or recognition. Her satisfaction came from knowing she had handled the situation with integrity, remaining calm and true to herself even under pressure. The acknowledgement, small as it was, mattered less than the quiet confidence she carried within her. As the day progressed, he left the restaurant, but she could feel the impact of the encounter lingering in the air. She returned to her duties, serving other customers, managing orders, and keeping the restaurant running smoothly. But inside, there was a sense of quiet triumph. She had met a challenge, faced scrutiny, maintained her composure without compromise. Her co-workers noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Some whispered about the man, speculating on his identity and influence. Others quietly admired her ability to remain calm and composed under pressure. She did not comment or boast. She simply continued with her work, moving with practiced ease, carrying the weight of the day with quiet strength. By the evening, the restaurant had settled into a gentle rhythm. She cleaned tables, organized the kitchen, and prepared for the next day. She thought about the events of the afternoon and the lessons they offered. Life often presented challenges, people who tested patience and character, and situations that could make one feel small or powerless. But she had learned once again that dignity, patience, and integrity could stand firm even against wealth, power, and expectation. When she finally closed the doors and turned off the lights, she felt a quiet satisfaction that went beyond the ordinary. She had faced someone who wielded influence and authority effortlessly and had not allowed it to shake her confidence or sense of self-worth. That knowledge, the understanding that she could hold her ground without confrontation, was a quiet victory, one that would stay with her far longer than any tip, compliment, or acknowledgement. She walked home that evening with her head held high, thinking about how strength often reveals itself not in grand gestures but in quiet, consistent actions. She understood now, more clearly than ever, that courage is not loud or dramatic. It is steady, calm, and unyielding. And sometimes it is in those small, quiet moments that true power is revealed. The next day, the restaurant opened as usual. She arrived early, as she always did, and moved through her morning routine. She straightened chairs, wiped tables, and checked supplies. The sun streamed through the windows, creating patterns on the floor, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Despite the normal routine, there was an unusual sense of anticipation in the back of her mind. She could feel it in the small twitch of her fingers, the alertness in her movements, the way she noticed details that might normally go unseen. When she took her place behind the counter and began setting up for breakfast, she heard the bell over the door. She looked up, expecting the usual customers, and froze for a brief moment. There he was, the billionaire. His presence filled the room immediately, commanding attention even without a word. He moved to a table near the window, but this time he did not look around the restaurant as if to assert dominance. Instead, he seemed quieter, more reflective, almost hesitant. She took a deep breath, smoothing her apron, and approached him with her usual calm professionalism. "Good morning, sir," she said with a gentle, steady smile. "Welcome back." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something different in his expression. The confident, slightly challenging look of the previous days had softened. There was curiosity there now, a quiet attempt to understand something he had not expected to encounter. "Good morning," he said, his tone lower, quieter, almost careful. She poured water for him as she always did, moving smoothly, her mind aware of the subtle shift in the energy around his table. "Are you ready to order, or would you like a few moments?" she asked politely. "I think I need a few minutes," he replied, and then, unexpectedly, he looked at her and added, "I realized something yesterday, or maybe the day before. I underestimated you." She nodded, maintaining her calm demeanor. "That can happen," she said simply, her tone neutral. She did not smile in a way that invited flattery or acknowledgement. She had no need for it. Her confidence came from doing her work with integrity, not from praise or recognition. He leaned back slightly, his gaze thoughtful. He had spent years in a world where power and wealth could bend almost anyone to his will. Yet here was someone who could remain completely herself, entirely unshaken by his influence, entirely independent in her dignity. He had expected deference and submission, and instead he found calm, quiet strength. He was both unsettled and intrigued as he began to speak more openly during breakfast. He started asking questions that went beyond the menu. He asked about her life, about her experiences, and about how she came to be working in a small restaurant despite her intelligence and composure. Most waitstaff would have been cautious, nervous, or evasive. But she answered truthfully, speaking with measured words that reflected her life without dramatizing it or seeking sympathy. "I've worked here for a few years," she said quietly. "I needed a job I could rely on, and this place has always treated me fairly. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work, and I take pride in it." He listened intently, leaning forward slightly, absorbing her words. There was a moment of silence between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with thought. She realized that he was beginning to see her differently. His curiosity was no longer about testing her patience or control. It was about understanding the person behind the calm demeanor. It's the person who refused to bend under pressure, the person whose integrity could not be bought or intimidated. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to her. She nodded again, her expression calm. "Us. Everyone has their challenges," she said simply. "Mine are just mine, and I deal with them the best I can." The billionaire studied her closely, as if piecing together a puzzle he had never expected to encounter. He had built his life on assumptions about people, about loyalty, about influence, but she did not fit any of those assumptions. She was neither intimidated nor overly cautious, neither flattering nor submissive. She was simply herself, and it was impossible to manipulate or control her in the ways he was accustomed to. Throughout the morning, he continued to test the boundaries, though less overtly than before. He asked for details about dishes, small adjustments to orders, sometimes questioned why something was done a certain way. She responded each time with calm precision, explaining clearly and politely, never raising her voice, never showing impatience. Each time he attempted to assert dominance, he met with quiet competence and dignity. Other customers noticed the subtle tension at his table. Some whispered, casting curious glances. They sensed a different kind of interaction, something more profound than the usual exchange between customer and staff. It was not about wealth or status. It was about principles, respect, and character. At one point, he asked for a recommendation not because he wanted to control the decision, but because he wanted to understand her judgment, her perspective. "What would you choose if it were your meal?" he asked, genuinely interested. She considered briefly and then suggested a dish, explaining why she liked it and why she thought it was special. She did not hesitate or second-guess herself. Her response was honest, simple, and thoughtful. He nodded, clearly impressed by her clarity and confidence. The conversation turned unexpectedly personal. He spoke about the pressure of his own life, the decisions, the responsibilities, the constant scrutiny. She listened, offering quiet acknowledgement rather than advice or judgment. She did not attempt to impress him, nor did she lower her dignity. She simply allowed him the space to speak and be heard. "You have a rare quality," he said finally, after a long pause. "Most people are so focused on what they can gain from others, on appearances, on influence. You are not like that." She shook her head slightly, still calm. "I believe in honesty and respect," she said. "I treat people as they should be treated, and I expect the same in return. That is all." He studied her, a faint smile forming. There was a sense of humility creeping into his expression, a recognition that the world he was used to, the world of wealth, power, and influence, was not the only measure of strength or worth. He had spent years assuming control over situations and people. And yet here he was, confronted with someone who did not respond to control, power, or intimidation. He realized that he had underestimated not just her, but the quiet strength of people who lived ordinary lives with dignity and courage. As breakfast ended, he did something unexpected. He left a generous tip, more significant than what he had left before. But it was not the money that mattered. It was the acknowledgement. It was the recognition that he had learned something he had not anticipated, a lesson about respect, humility, and the power of integrity. She returned to her duties, serving other customers, refilling drinks, and managing orders with her usual grace. Her coworkers noticed a subtle change in her demeanor, not that she had changed, but that there was a quiet satisfaction in her movements, a calm assurance that came from knowing she had faced a challenge and held her ground with dignity. Throughout the day, she reflected on the encounter. It was rare to meet someone so powerful who expected submission and then learned, quietly and unexpectedly, that respect cannot be demanded, bought, or intimidated. It was a reminder of the strength in remaining true to oneself, in acting with calm authority, and in maintaining dignity under scrutiny. By the evening, the restaurant was quiet. She cleaned tables, organized the kitchen, and prepared for the next day. The memory of the billionaire lingered, but it no longer carried tension or challenge. It carried a quiet acknowledgement of what? She already knew, that true strength is not measured by wealth or status, but by calm integrity, self-respect, and the courage to stand firm in one's principles. As she walked home that night, she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had faced someone accustomed to control and influence, and she had not wavered. She had shown that patience, dignity, and honesty were more powerful than wealth or authority, and she knew deep down that this understanding would stay with her long after the encounter had passed. shaping the way she carried herself and all challenges yet to come. The morning air was crisp. Carrying the faint scent of coffee and baked bread from nearby cafes, she arrived at the restaurant a little earlier than usual. Tying her apron carefully and moving through her familiar morning routine, straightening chairs, wiping down tables, arranging utensils, she felt a quiet rhythm to her work, a rhythm that grounded her even as the day ahead promised challenges. Though the previous encounters with him had left a subtle mark on her mind, she tried to focus on the day ahead. There were regular customers to greet, orders to take, and the constant flow of dishes and drinks that kept the restaurant alive. Still, there was an almost electric anticipation in her movements, a small awareness that he might return. She did not dwell on it, for she knew that worrying over things she could not control would only distract her from doing her best. As the lunch crowd began to fill the restaurant, the bell over the door chimed and she looked up. Sure enough, he walked in. And this time, there was something different in his posture. He did not move with the same commanding confidence that had filled the previous days. Instead, there was a certain quiet hesitance, a reflective air that drew attention without forcing it. Customers glanced at him, but she met his gaze calmly, acknowledging his presence without any hint of intimidation or flattery. Good afternoon, she said softly, her voice steady. Welcome back. He looked up at her, a faint, thoughtful smile forming on his lips. Good afternoon, he replied, his tone more subdued than before. He took a seat, and for the first time he seemed to wait, as if willing her to approach at her own pace, not his. She poured his water and handed him the menu with her usual calm grace. Are you ready to order, or would you like a few moments? She asked politely.